Joining us in studio are Diane Foley and Colum McCann. Together, they are the co-authors of American Mother. Welcome to Jesuitical, Diane and Colum.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's a real joy and honor to be talking with you both today. This is such an incredible book, an incredible story, an incredible witness to your son, Diane, James Foley. You call him Jim throughout the book. Is it right if that's how we refer to him?
Yes.
Maybe one place we could start is him finding his vocation as a young person. You talk in the book about what his Jesuit education meant to him at Marquette. And so I thought, since this is a Jesuit podcast, that would be a place we could start.
Absolutely. I think Jim's eyes were open in many ways at Marquette University. He had grown up in a rural, middle-class kind of home in New Hampshire. And when he moved to the city of Milwaukee and Marquette University, it bordered on neighborhoods that were much poorer, and really there were needs there that the university was working on addressing. So freshmen were invited to tutor in the inner city right from freshman year, and Jim did. And it was through a lot of that work and going on mission trips to Indian reservations, Habitat for Humanity, that I think his eyes were open to how others live in the United States, that not everyone has the privilege of a middle-class upbringing, if you will. And he worked with a lot of kids whose parents were not present or were incarcerated or who lived with violence or drugs. And I think it really opened Jim's eyes to the needs of those communities.
I think a lot of young people, myself included, go to college and if they did grow up with some level of privilege, they feel this like pressure that they need to fix the world. And a lot of kids, then see the world and get a little disillusioned, and it never turns into an actual vocation. But with Jim, it stuck. He was in college, and then he pursued this career that was focused on, he saw places of injustice and wanted to be there, whether that was an under-resourced school. He did Teach for America, or wars and the victims of that. So I'm curious, what was it in him that kept him engaged and committed to that justice-oriented vocation?
Well, that's a good question, Ashley. I'm not sure, really, except that Jim was always a very sensitive person, and he always seemed to care about the underdog. I never realized how much he did even in high school. He had all kinds of friends from all kinds of groups. He was never exclusive to any one group. So it was just kind of Jim. I think he was drawn to those who have less and wanted everyone to have access to education and to opportunities, and wasn't sure what he'd be good at. And that's partly why I went into Teach for America. I thought, I'll try that. And it was a challenging job to go to the inner city of Phoenix, Arizona, and try to teach these fifth graders. They were tough on him, actually. It was very challenging for him and eye-opening, I think. Yeah.
And what was, when Jim decides to become a journalist, how did he talk to his family about that? And what were you all thinking, especially when he's decided to become a conflict journalist?
Well, it took a while. He spent years teaching, went back to get his first master's in creative writing, and for years working on writing fiction, actually, and but finally found journalism, and he decided he really wanted to tell real stories, true stories, if you will, and became incredibly passionate about the role of journalism in our democracy, if you will. So he was delighted when he finally found it. And for us, we were glad that he'd found something he was passionate about. And I think my husband and I were rather ignorant about how dangerous it could be, to be honest.
Colum, when you were getting to know Jim, I'm curious what drew you to him. There's a story about you spotting a photo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that sort of what sparked that? Could you tell that story?
Yeah, I think I was drawn to Jim for several different reasons. One in particular was there was a photograph of him that's set aside from that sort of brutally iconic photograph of him in the desert. This was an altogether different one where he was sitting in a bunker in Afghanistan reading a book. And if you look closely at the book, I could see it was a book of mine that I'd written called Let the Great World Spin. And so I have felt this kinship with Jim, but also Jim was interested in telling the stories in the anonymous corners of human experience. He's the one who would go into the market in Damascus or Baghdad or wherever it happened to be, and he would find the story that's over there in the dusty corner, and he would invigorate the humanity there. And rather than just doing pure journalism, there was an element of him that really wanted to get to all the sort of ineffable things, the important questions. And I was very attracted to that. And I do think, and Diane and I have talked about it, that Jim and I never met him, but I sort of meet him now every single day, not only in the pages of this book, but he sort of whispers, he sits on my shoulder at times and whispers to me, tells me to look after his mom and make sure her story gets out in the world.
One thing I was really moved by in your book is you talk about how you got to know parts of Jim's life that you probably wouldn't have if this book didn't happen. Like, you heard from parts of his college friends and his high school friends and colleagues that filled out the story of his life that you were not a party to. I'm wondering, like, what that was like to get a fuller picture of your son even after his death.
It's interesting sometimes as a parent. Once your children grow up, sometimes it's hard to know how are they in the world, besides you might know what job they have, but what kind of a person are they? What kind of a friend or colleague they might be? And so with Jim, I started to learn who he was from the moment he died, truly. And in doing the film, the James Foley story also, because they interviewed the hostages Jim was held with. This was a whole other experience. It was kind of the accumulation of all I've learned over 10 years. So many beautiful people I've met because of Jim's work. He touched so many lives. And I was kind of curious to meet Alexander Cody. And I knew Jim would not have wanted me to be afraid to talk to him. But I was hoping
this was one of his captors.
Yes. So I was hoping he might share some of what went on during the 2 years he was held captive.
So that's actually where this book begins. It's very arresting, the scene of you sort of getting to meet. Could you set the scene? I'm not going to try to do
I'll
it
let
right now.
Colum. He does it very well.
Because you were there. You were there, right?
I was there. Diane decided that she was going to go and talk to her son's killer. It was part of a plea agreement that he had undertaken. We went down to Virginia together. We went into a courthouse, and right in the middle of this courthouse, in this big echoing room with no windows, there were a lot of FBI agents, defense, prosecutors, security people, but over in one corner was Alexander Cody sitting at a table with shackles on his feet and in his prison garb. And Diane went in the most courageous act that I've come across from someone in many, many years, and she sat not 4 feet from him, and she said hello, and she said, "It is nice to meet you, Alexander." And then they proceeded to talk about faith, about conviction, about love, about sacrifice, about violence, about war, about the most profound things. And the whole room disappeared. And I was witness to it, and it was one of the most incredible moments of my life to be witness to it. And ultimately it became about what I term is Diane's genius of compassion. As a very ordinary person, who is actually truly, truly extraordinary. And we won't give too much away about what happens, but it was one of those moments when, for me, the world was set aglow in all sorts of ways.
One of the things that I wanted to dig into on this podcast in particular is you mentioned that you felt the Holy Spirit was in the room.
Absolutely.
Could you say more
Well,
about that?
when we had the opportunity to meet Alexander, there were 2 British jihadists who were arrested in 2018 and finally extradited to Virginia for trial. But Alexander Cody pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of kidnapping, torture, and complicity to murder. So he did not have a trial, and he offered to meet with victims. So that was the part that was different about him. And
you're also the first
yes,
one to meet with him.
I knew right away that I wanted to meet with him, but then none of my family wanted to come with me. And so I thought, oh, okay. Do I want to go alone? And then that's when Colum said, Diane, I'll go with you. And I was so grateful because I knew I wanted to meet him, but I wasn't so sure when I thought I'd have to go alone. So Colum did accompany me, but then as it grew closer, I was kind of nervous about it because I wanted to be able to see him as the human being he is. And try to put aside the horrific things he'd done to Jim and how he'd kidnapped him and tortured him. So I had to pray a lot about that. I really did. I had to pray to put aside my feelings and really try to see him as a person who made choices that will affect his life for the rest of his life. And it was incredible when we were there. I mean, it felt like the Holy Spirit was truly present because I was able to listen to him and he was able to listen to me. And it was really quite beautiful.
One of the tensions in those scenes is trying to figure out, is he being honest? Is he telling the truth? Is he trying to manipulate us?
Is he sorry?
Is he actually? Yeah, we won't say how that ends. But how do you try to capture? You didn't get to interview him, but you have to capture his humanity in some way through the lens of or through Diane's eyes. How did you try to, paint his picture?
It's all about complication. We live in these times that are absolutely diseased with certainty, and everybody wants a simple answer. And there was no simple answer there with him. He was lying, and then he wasn't lying. He did have a huge heart, and then he had a shrunken, hard heart. He had beaten Jim, and he had participated in the killing, and he had written the final words. And yet we were there, and we were looking at all the different ledges of humanity that were available in front of us. And in certain ways, Diane and I even looked at each other after the first hour and a half. We had a little cup of coffee, and we were surprised. Not that we actually liked him, but maybe we liked him. We certainly had begun to begin understanding him. And and at one stage, Diane said to Alexander, she said, "Oh, I think that you and my son, whose life you took, could have been friends." Can you imagine what that was like to be in that room and to have that sort of thing said? Yeah, the Holy Spirit was there.
I mean, this is what I imagine some bit of heaven being like, in some ways, like this is the scandal of God's love and mercy in a lot of ways. And so I cannot, for that to happen in this Virginia courtroom with no windows, I mean, it must have been astounding. Where did you find the strength to? I can't imagine talking to this guy, let alone wanting to see him in his humanity. That to me just sounds like the definition of godliness.
Well, Jim has challenged me. Jim was a better person than I will ever be. Jim really has challenged me to see the good in people, if you will. I mean, that was really evident to me. And that after Jim was killed, I felt hugely challenged to find a silver lining, to really make Jim's sacrifice and the other Americans and British lives worthwhile. So that's why we started the James Foley Legacy Foundation and prayed for strength, prayed so hard not to be bitter, but to try to forgive myself, our government, all that was involved in the horror of it all that caused our country to abandon these Americans and such. So it wouldn't be possible without God's love and mercy.
Yeah. So I think most listeners will know at least some parts of Jim's story because it was public in the most horrific of ways. But I don't think they know, your part of the story. And really, he was in captivity for 2 years. So could you describe what he went through and what you went through during that period of uncertainty?
Sure. Well, Jim was taken hostage in the Thanksgiving Day of 2012, and we never heard his voice again. So, but even that, we found out the next morning, the day after Thanksgiving, through a colleague who said he'd been taken, and he had disappeared. Nobody who witnessed the kidnapping knew who the captors were. We had no idea if he'd been killed or was still alive or not for 9 months. It was September of 2013 when we finally found out he was alive in a prison in northern Syria. But it was a time of great anguish and terror, really, because we had no idea what was going on. And in many ways, I'm glad I didn't, because Jim was going through his own hellish ordeal. He was starved and beaten repeatedly, nearly died during that year. And I really wouldn't have known anything about it if it wasn't for one of his childhood friends, Brian Oakes, interviewing those hostages who were freed, the European hostages. They're the ones that shared what the ordeal was like in the film, Jim, the James Foley Story. So that's how I learned some of what he'd gone through.
And you had gotten a letter of sorts that he had through one of these hostages that had been released, correct?
Right. The last hostage, a Danish hostage, memorized a letter. They were too afraid to actually bring one out of captivity, but they memorized Jim's words to us, which was a blessing, a huge blessing.
When you the book recounts, you're kind of finding out that James has been killed with the rest of us.
Oh,
right.
Absolutely.
I mean, and so you're trying to talk to your family, to like the government, to the world, the media. What were those sort of first couple of days like?
Well, they were horrific. We were hoping that the images of Jim's murder were photoshopped or some cruel joke, and so we emailed and called everyone we'd ever been in contact with in the government or outside of government, but really didn't find out for sure until President Obama announced it to the world on television.
I was kind of shocked to hear that that's how you had to find out officially. And you write in the book about Obama did eventually call you, but it's shocking to me that no one in the government let you know first. In any natural disaster, police incident, they don't release names until the victims' families have been notified. Do you have any idea?
I really think it was just a symptom of the shock, that it wasn't just our family who was shocked. I really feel our government was shocked.
Yeah, I mean, the entire country was shocked.
And we had no one in the government at that time whose job it was to help us or to notify us, if you will, or be in touch with us families.
Colum, do you remember where you were when you found out about the story?
I remember I was in my office, and I was completely shocked, and then later I got the photograph of him reading one of my books, and I'm reminded of a line that's very important to me, and I think it's important for us to talk about. There's this line from the Mu'allaqat, which are these 6th century pre-Islamic Arabic poems that used to be hung in the marketplaces in the Middle East, and it's a really a deeply human Christian notion too. But it says, "Is there any hope that this desolation will bring us solace?" And I'm reminded of how I felt that day, and how I thought there could be no solace that comes from this. But now that it's 10 years on, and it's the 10th year anniversary, and I've seen that everything that Diane has done to change the whole landscape of hostage thinking, and how we think about hostage taking, wrongfully held people. Over 100 Americans have come home due to her advocacy and the advocacy of others, and there's something beautiful about this story too. There is a solace that came out of the desolation, and I think it's profoundly important that it was a woman who was in her 60s when this happened, and who has now for the past decade sort of invigorated the whole debate around this, and that this sort of stuff is actually possible.
You mentioned how what you do wouldn't be possible without the strength that Jim and God have given you, and one of his core values that he spoke about in his life and that you write about in the book is moral courage. Can you either of you unpack what that meant for Jim?
Sure. I really had never thought about moral courage, and but Jim was a deep thinker. He really thought about deeper truths, and when he was briefly arrested by Gaddafi's troops in Libya, and after he returned from Libya, he went kind of on what he called a gratitude tour. He had several places he stopped and spoke, and one of them was Marquette University, his undergraduate alma mater. And when he was there, he spoke about how much he had prayed during captivity, and he knew we were praying for him and how he could feel that. But he also spoke about how he aspired as a journalist to be a man of moral courage. And I thought, it was something he really felt, that we really couldn't have good journalism without a moral courage to dare to report the truth, if you will, even if it meant he lost his job or was reprimanded or ridiculed for what he had to report. And that really challenged me as a person. I thought, well, then I really need to have the courage to try to be part of fixing our government's response when an innocent American is taken hostage or kidnapped abroad. So it really challenged me to dare to speak truth to power, if you will, to dare in my own modest way to make some changes. Because I was a nurse practitioner, so I knew nothing about politics or our hostage policy or journalism for that matter. So the courage to try was definitely from God, certainly not of me.
Colum, what did that mean to you as a writer when you were learning about Jim's convictions to tell the truth?
I felt it was just entirely true to his spirit. This idea of moral courage. He had physical courage. He knew that. But what he really aspired to was this deeper courage. Why did he go to Syria? He went to Syria because he wanted to tell the stories of Syrian people and bring them back home to us. He wanted to sort of increase the lungs of our awareness back here. He would never have written about Jim Foley. He was only ever going to write about others. He was a person who had given himself over to telling the truth, and he knew the world was held together with stories and storytelling, and he was quite masterful at it. All the guys who he was embedded with, and all the people that you talk to, all the journalists, they all say that he was tough and he asked really tough questions, but he was trying to get to the deep heart's core of everything that was going on.
And you mentioned his motivation for going there, which I think one type of person sees as very noble and essential to the world. But there's another group of people that are like, well, he went on his own volition. Why should, we have been trying to help him at that point? I mean, as a mother, what were you thinking when you heard stuff like that?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. And I think sometimes people forget that we need policemen, we need firemen, we need people, we need journalists in conflict zones so that we know what's happening. I mean, that there is inherent danger in certain professions. There's no question about it. But those professions are fundamental to our democracy in many ways. If we don't know what's happening in the world, how can we learn or vote accordingly for people to lead us? So, but as a parent, I became more and more concerned about safety for him.
Yeah, and there are hints of, I don't know if anger is the right word, but resistance to him. So he comes back, he's held in captivity in Libya, he comes back, and then, he wants to go back to a conflict zone. And I get the sense from the book that some of his siblings were like, don't do this to us again. I'm wondering how that was for you. Was there any,
I think it was hard for Jim.
Yeah.
I think he tried he tried a stateside job as an editor. He he went on a job with Human Rights Watch. He tried different aspects of that might have a safer way of being, but he really felt what was happening in dangerous parts of the world were staff journalists were leaving the area because it was too unsafe. So the reality is we Westerners would have known nothing about what was going on in many parts of the world.
It was unsafe, and you have big newspapers deciding it's just not economically viable anymore, so they're pulling people out of these things too. So they're coming at it from both ends. So there really are there's this massive dearth of people covering these conflict situations.
Absolutely. So without the brave freelancers daring to go in and know and find out what's really happening, we wouldn't have any idea. They'd be total black holes of information. We wouldn't know.
We mentioned you got a call from the president, a brief call, and that was followed a couple of days later by another call. Do you want to reveal who else you heard from in Rome?
Sure. We actually heard from Pope Francis first. Oh, wow. Pope Francis called us within a day, maybe I think it was the second day after Jim was killed. And we were so surprised that because his nephew had been in a car accident in that same time frame. So here he was reaching across the world to us. We were so touched by his compassion. And he called Jim a martyr, for press freedom. And it just touched our hearts and really provided much consolation just to know that he was thinking of us. It was wonderful.
I'm curious if you mentioned multiple times in the book the different spiritual leaders in your life or figures in your life, priests and friends. What if there's a couple things that maybe were said to you or ways that people accompanied you from your faith community throughout all of this?
Oh, well, I think to be honest, during the time of Jim's captivity, it was difficult. It was difficult for friends. It was difficult for our church community. They prayed with us. We had vigils. They stood with us. But the outpouring after Jim died was phenomenal. I mean, we had messages and prayers and gifts, outreach from literally all over the world for a full year. We had buckets of mail and donations, which also led us to start the Foley Foundation, to actually try to find a way to do some good with what had happened. But it was as if God sent angels to lift me up, to hold us up, to encourage us, to love us. It was a real strong feeling of love and support.
Colum, can you describe for us the kind of work that Diane is doing in terms of changing how we treat hostage situations in the U.S.? What has been the status quo, and what's kind of the work that's being done to change it?
Well, I just want you to imagine a woman, knocking on doors, going out to Congress, walking through the rain under an umbrella, trying to make sure that she got down to a hotel and get across Washington, D.C. because she wanted to talk to yet another congressman. At the end of this particular book, after she has seen her son's killer and bid goodbye, the first thing she does is that she goes back to Congress to lobby for yet another family. What Diane did was that she decided, just like Jim had decided, that her life was for others. And I don't want to embarrass her, but I think it's an incredibly profound thing that she has done and continues to do. Helping get acts in front of Congress, helping to change the nature of the way we talk about this whole subject. You can talk, Diane, specifically about laws that have been enacted and so on.
Well, yes, I would hope that people can, or anyone who reads the book might be inspired to do their part. Because here I was totally ignorant about Washington, totally ignorant. And if an old person like me can help make some change in hostage policy, anything is possible.
Yeah. And so basically, is the policy that the U.S. government refuses to pay any ransom?
Yes,
sums?
but that wasn't the policy that. Yes, that policy is still the case.
Mm-hmm.
But what was different was in 2012 when Jim was taken and the others, there was no hostage enterprise. There was absolutely no one at the FBI, State Department, or White House whose job it was to help a family of an innocent American who'd been kidnapped or wrongfully detained. There was no one. And now there's a U.S. hostage enterprise, which is quite robust, actually, and a law, the Levinson Act, which was enacted in 2020, which codified this hostage enterprise. So we have someone at the State Department, FBI, and White House who keeps track of various Americans who've been kidnapped or wrongfully arrested abroad. There's still huge challenges, however, because now different nation states like Russia are targeting citizens abroad. China, Iran, Venezuela, Syria continue to target U.S. nationals. So there's still a lot of challenge, and for journalists these days. Journalists are not protected like they used to be. These days, on one side of a conflict or a riot might not want a journalist giving their unbiased point of view. They might want to give their biased viewpoint, if you will. So it can be more dangerous to be a journalist these days, too. So there are still lots of challenges, but it's miraculous, some of the changes. We've gone from a president who refused to even talk to the captors to a president who's saying he prioritizes the return of Americans. And to me, that's Jim's legacy, and truly miraculous. It's of God. It's a lot of good people who needed to step up and make that happen.
Have you been able to come into community with some of the other families?
Oh, definitely. With the 3 other American families, we went to Washington together in the spring of 2014, trying to advocate together. And I've met the British hostages as well as all the European ones. And there's a lot of solidarity, and a lot of hostages who have returned since 2014 have joined us and help us. So we're becoming a growing community. Unfortunately, no one wanted to be part of this community, but it's a community that recognizes the national security threat and the need to work together with other Western partners so we can, God willing, deter the practice of ever using human beings as political pawns in war.
You mentioned this is one of Jim's legacy. I'm wondering about his legacy in the world of journalism. We have a fellowship here at America, and the first year we had it, we had a candidate who came on as a fellow who said he was inspired to pursue journalism because of James Foley. He was a Marquette grad. So I'm curious if you've heard more stories like that.
Many. I've heard many. And Jim has inspired a lot of young journalists, and that's part of our work. We want to make sure that any young journalists who are inspired by Jim and the need for really good journalism also know how to keep themselves safe. That we have an undergraduate and graduate level safety education that we really we promote in a big way at schools of journalism.
Diane, Colum, want to thank you both for coming in today. But before we let you go, we ask all of our guests this question, which is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why? Draw sticks to see who goes first. Or draw straws to see who goes first.
Go on, Diane.
Jim was a much better person than I ever could be, and I've learned from Jim, and I've also learned to see the goodness in so many good people, both in our government, in our church, in our community, people who were strangers previously. So I feel as human beings we're capable of evil and also great good. And thanks be to God, I've seen a lot of the good.
We've had a lot of guests canonize their mothers, but not too many have canonized their children. So
I have Jim in my ear, as I said earlier. And, Jim definitely would not want to be a person to be over-sainted, in any way. I've spent a lot of time now with Diane, and she'd be my candidate.
I don't even think that requires an explanation, so we'll leave it at that. Once again, the book is American Mother, and it is out wherever books are sold. Diane, Colum, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time. So appreciate you both.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.